Alright, this is going to be a response to a series of videos that TVP Challenge made addressing me. From now on, I'm going to address TVP Challenge as Brandy to make things simpler. She starts off quoting me, bringing up the fact that Zeitgeist moving forward continuous. Hold on one second. No. Move! Oh. Okay. Okay. Brandy starts off quoting me, bringing up the fact that Zeitgeist, moving forward, continuously equated what is currently happening in this state-controlled economy with what would happen under a free market economy. She then shows a clip of Peter Joseph saying that this is completely irrelevant to the arguments presented in the documentary. This is simply untrue. For example, I have already explained how the government causes giant wealth disparities through the laws and regulations it enacts that allows monopolies to form, and thus charge higher prices for their products, and lower wages to their employees. Wealth disparities that would not have existed if it weren't for the state controlling the economy. Hopefully, we at least can agree that when the government makes competition illegal, then it becomes a lot easier for monopolies to form. To say that this is irrelevant is being disingenuous. My original point stands. The documentary continuously tries to argue that this is what is currently going on in this particular monetary system, therefore this is what will go on in all forms of monetary systems. This is fallacious logic. I could use the same logic to argue that this apple is red, therefore all apples are red. Peter Joseph then argues that all monetary systems use financial coercion, that you must submit to the system in order to gain wealth and hence to gain the necessities of life. Firstly, Peter is using misleading terms like submit and financial coercion. Let's say that I break off a branch from a tree in the middle of nowhere, and I carve it into a little statue. Now, does the fact that I would only agree to give you my statue if you give me something I value even more mean that I am financially coercing you? That I am forcing you to submit to me? No. In fact, the opposite is the case. If you disregard my wishes and take my statue without my consent, then it is you who is using coercion. It is you who is enslaving me. So it would be wrong to think in terms of having to submit yourself to a system in order to obtain goods and services, because what is actually happening is trading. And since trading is consensual, you have to bring something to the table as well. You cannot simply expect people to labor for you for free. Now, that is selfishness. But aside from these misleading terms, this is yet another example of Peter conflating all forms of monetary systems. In the voluntary society that I advocate, different cities would voluntarily decide what basic universal necessities they would like to fund. And so in some cities, you very well might decide to sit around and do nothing at all, and still be able to gain the necessities of life. And the system I advocate uses no more financial coercion than the Venus Project would. Like it or not, resources will still be scarce, even under the Venus Project. And because of this, not everyone will be able to gain all of the resources they may wish for. Instead, who gets to use what resources would be people believed to be putting those resources toward their best uses. This is exactly what happens in the voluntary society I advocate as well. So if you wish to call this financial coercion, then in order to be logically consistent, you would have to admit that the Venus Project would be guilty of financial coercion as well, or rather, resource coercion to be more accurate. For more information on the system that I advocate, please see my video, The State is Not Great. Brandy then shows a clip of Peter saying that he would be happy to see a monetary system that has no debt and no interest. That interest is the basic flaw of a monetary system. This is yet another example of Peter conflating all monetary systems. It is technically true that under a central bank and fractional reserve banking system that creates money out of thin air, a musical chairs situation will occur, where it is impossible for society to pay off all its debt, because only the principal is created, not the interest, and therefore this central banking and fractional reserve money system leads to a society with perpetual debt, where the bank's percentage of wealth continuously grows larger and larger. For example, let's say that Fred, no relation to the Fed, decides to print off some Fred dollars, and he then walks into a town and whips out his gun and proclaims that anyone not using his Fred dollars as a medium of exchange will be arrested and imprisoned. So everyone trades in their real money for these Fred dollars, and they proceed to use these Fred dollars as if they were money. Let's say that 1,000,000 Fred dollars now exist in circulation. Fred now decides to print off 1,000,000,000 Fred dollars and then loan it all out at 50% annual interest. At the end of the year, the debtors in the town owe Fred 1.5 billion Fred dollars, but only 1.1 billion Fred dollars actually exist in the town. Thus, the debt is impossible to completely pay off. The only alleviation to this is if Fred were to print another 400 million Fred dollars and then use it to buy goods and services from his remaining debtors, who are then finally able to pay off their debt. But as you can see, this leads to Fred owning the vast majority of the wealth, when he has not contributed any good or service whatsoever. All he did was print off Fred dollars and force people to treat them as money. But in a free market, this is not what takes place. No one is allowed to use violence and coercion to monopolize the medium of exchange, and thus the money that exists in a free market is something that has proven itself to have the key emergent properties of a stable supply and great difficulty to counterfeit. That is to say, something you can't easily create more of by simply printing more zeros on a piece of paper, or by entering more zeros into a computer. Historically, when governments don't intervene, this tends to be gold and silver. So, how does credit work in a free market? Well, instead of a bank being allowed to create money out of thin air, it is only able to loan out the money that someone deposits, and the depositor cannot be allowed to withdraw his deposit until the loan is paid back. Thus, neither the principal nor the interest of the loan is created. It is merely reallocated. So, for example, Fred dies and everyone celebrates and goes back to using real money. Bob prefers to invest some of his money in the present so that he can hopefully have more money to spend in the future. So Bob deposits 100 ounces of gold into a bank. The bank then lends out that 100 ounces of gold with an interest of 50%. A year later, Bob and the bank get back 150 ounces of gold and split the interest. Aha! But where did that extra 50 ounces of gold come from? It came from the rest of the economy. Rather than simply printing money out of thin air, which does nothing but cause inflation and allows you to steal resources from the economy, Bob and the bank are actually contributing to the economy. Bob is providing the good of capital. He is sacrificing his present consumption so that entrepreneurs have the capital they need to start their businesses and help to contribute to the economy in their own right. And the bank is providing the service of figuring out how to best allocate that scarce capital so as to best maximize the chances of the loan being paid back, and thus it is helping in the process of figuring out which entrepreneurial propositions are good and which ones are not. And Bob and the bank are not merely providing value to the economy so that they can have some more yellow metal in their hands. They are providing value so that they can obtain more goods and services from the economy in the future. And thus, rather than the percentage of wealth the banks own in the economy continually growing larger and larger, there is a continuous cycle of wealth being spread around. Someone, such as Bob and the bank, contributes to the economy and is thus granted a larger portion of the goods and services in the economy that they may consume. They then consume those goods and services, which was the motivation for their original contribution. Since neither the principal nor the interest of a loan is created, it has to come from the rest of the economy, and thus it is impossible for the banks to give out so many loans that the principal plus the interest is actually more than the amount of money that exists in the economy, because free market banks actually have the incentive to get their money back, plus the interest. And so a free market bank would never make a loan that would be impossible to pay back, since if the loan is not paid back, then the bank actually loses money. But the government couldn't care less if its Frankensteinian banks are not able to get the money back, since they can just keep printing all the money they could ever want. And so the only reason this lending scheme is done under government-controlled economies is to cause society to become even more dependent on that particular fiat currency, thus allowing them to continue leeching from the economy. Brandy quotes me saying that money facilitates the growth of an economy, and then shows a clip of Peter saying that expansion is the greatest detriment to social survival, regardless of the context. When I say economic growth, when I'm not talking about increasing the human population or increasing the money supply. I am talking about the effect that capital has on increasing the efficiency and productivity, and the effect that trade has on allowing us to obtain the things we value more in exchange for the things we value less. This video is brought to you by Coca-Cola, which you have now been brainwashed to go and purchase after viewing this video. Brandy then quotes me saying that without money, you cannot calculate profit and loss. And without being able to calculate profit and loss, you are not able to calculate how to allocate resources in the most efficient way. Then she shows a clip of Douglas Mallet, sorry if I mispronounced that, saying that efficiency is not economic, it is scientific. This is a confusion that I see happening a lot. Scientific efficiency deals in a world where resources are infinite. Economic efficiency deals in a world where resources are scarce. In other words, let's say that you only have enough resources to produce a super widget, or a super gadget, or a mediocre widget and gadget. Scientific efficiency might be able to tell you how to make the best widget, or the best gadget, but it cannot tell you which one you should produce at the highest quality, or if you should produce both at a lower quality, or if you should produce neither. For that, you need economic efficiency, because what should be produced is ultimately a question that can only be answered by the subjective preferences of the people in a society. First, you need entrepreneurs to predict the future marginal utility of consumers. You then need a process of bidding over resources, not only to filter out those who are bad at predicting the future marginal utility of consumers, but also so that objective numerical values can finally be placed on homogeneous resources, which will then finally allow you to calculate heterogeneous resources with each other, and thus figure out production costs. You then need a way to communicate these production costs to the consumer, through a simple numerical value. Only then can the consumer create a list of marginal utility, that is to say, which things they value the most when taking their price into account, which will render the final judgment as to whether the entrepreneurs made a profit or loss, and thus whether their predictions were correct or not. Without private property, you cannot have exchanges. If you cannot have exchanges, then you cannot determine prices. If you cannot determine prices, then you cannot calculate heterogeneous resources with each other. If you cannot calculate heterogeneous resources with each other, then you cannot determine production costs. If you cannot determine production costs, then you cannot determine marginal utility. And thus it is impossible to know what people value the most when taking production cost into account, and it will thus be impossible to allocate resources in the way that best satisfies consumers. Since the Venus Project refuses to allow money, exchanges, or private property, it destroys the foundational information required for economic calculation. Because of this, the Venus Project central computer is only able to make arbitrary decisions about how to allocate resources. Brandy then shows a clip of Peter Joseph saying that the idea that you can't have efficient allocation of resources without prices is only true within the current market model, that it has nothing to do with anything on a physical, tangible level. This is just a bare assertion. Peter asserts that you are able to derive marginal utility without production costs. This is false, and Peter does not explain how it can be done without prices. He just reasserts that it can somehow be done scientifically, and to say that the allocation of resources has nothing to do with anything on a physical or tangible level is simply wrong. Resources are indeed on a physical and tangible level. Peter goes on to say that a market economy assumes that the public knows what the hell they're doing. It makes no such assumption. Economics says nothing of values. It merely shines light on how to best achieve whatever your values might be. I would completely agree that the consumptionist culture of today should be changed. I would advocate changing it to one of caring more about donating to charity and investing in technological progress. But once we achieve that zeitgeist, then a market will be the best way of seeing those goals fulfilled in reality. You shouldn't be blaming the market for the values that people have. The market is just a means. It is not an end. Peter then says that human needs are empirical and quantifiable. Now, while I would agree that we can quantify human needs generally speaking, food, water, shelter, social interaction, etc., that does not mean that we can therefore determine how to best fulfill those needs without a price system. For example, humans require sleep, and so I imagine a very scientifically efficient way to provide this is a building that is packed, full of rotating bunk beds that someone else sleeps in while you are awake. While this might be scientifically efficient, it is not necessarily economically efficient, because something tells me that most people would prefer more than just a time slot for a rotating bunk bed. Another example is food. As far as scientific efficiency, I believe the crop that produces the highest calories per square foot is potatoes, and so the central computer will decide to create a diet for us humans, that is centered around potatoes, and it will only produce a few other foods for us that will meet the dietary requirements that potatoes are deficient in, as well as having the highest calorie production per square foot. While this might be scientifically efficient, it is not necessarily economically efficient, because something tells me that most people would not be content with just a potato-based diet, that many people would prefer diets consisting of foods that are not the most scientifically efficient to produce. And so unless you are able to find out the marginal utility of consumers, which cannot be done without private property and market prices, then you are left only being able to determine scientific efficiency, without being able to determine economic efficiency. Just because we might be able to determine some of the biological necessities of humans does not mean that we are therefore able to determine what their marginal utility would be. Peter says that a computer system can very, very easily, just like the inventory in a store, track what's there, what's moving, what isn't, and also orient new demand. This is completely ignoring the calculation problem. So let's say you have an inventory warehouse that has all the products the central computer has decided to create, and the inventory warehouse keeps track of which products are used. This process cannot tell you the marginal utility of consumers, because the products in the inventory warehouse are all free, and thus they do not communicate the production cost information to the consumer. So even assuming that you are able to change the zeitgeist to make consumers care much more about preserving as much as possible, it would not matter, because they are not given the necessary information they need, otherwise known as a price, to figure out whether product A has a higher production cost than product B. And you cannot determine production costs themselves without private property, exchange, and money, as I've already explained. To put it another way, the only kind of calculation that the Venus Project could do without prices is calculate the total amount of resources expended to create something. It cannot calculate how to best mix those resources with each other so as to meet the goal of best satisfying consumers, because you cannot calculate heterogeneous resources with each other until you use a method of converting homogeneous resources into an objective numerical value that is based off of the marginal utility of consumers themselves. Peter talking about monitoring usage to orient new demand is hinting at something that I'm not entirely sure the Venus Project wishes to admit to, that even in the resource-based economy, humans will still wish for more than just the basic necessities of life. If the preferences of humans are simply all market brainwashing, then companies wouldn't care whatsoever about what they're selling and instead focus all their capital on marketing. Companies could merely sell grains of dirt to hundreds of dollars rather than trying to produce things that have at least some kind of utility. If the Venus Project truly could scientifically determine everything that should be created based off of analyzing the needs of human beings, then monitoring usage to orient new demand would not only be irrelevant, it would be scientifically wasteful. So if someone complains to the central computer that they want more than potatoes and multivitamins, then the central computer should respond with negative. That would be inefficient. And so the Venus Project needs to answer the following question. Is the goal to treat humans as biological machines that must be kept alive in the most scientifically efficient way, or is the goal to treat human beings as human beings, individuals with their own preferences that, in all likelihood, are above and beyond the basic necessities of life? Herein lies what I believe to be the crippling blow to the Venus Project. If the goal is to treat humans as drones, then that is not the society at least I wish to live in. However, if the goal is to create a society that maximizes human satisfaction, then the Venus Project has to acknowledge that what is most scientifically efficient is very often not what provides the most utility. And in order to figure out marginal utility, you need prices. Peter says that in a resource-based economy, if a resource becomes more scarce, then prices will not rise. Well, of course, since prices do not exist in a resource-based economy. That instead, a more strategic way is found to allocate the resource. Again, without prices, the resource-based economy can only determine a scientific strategy to allocate resources, because it is impossible for it to find an economic strategy to allocate resources. And in a market system, this process is automatic. If a resource becomes more scarce, supply and demand forces the price to go up, and thus the resource will automatically be used in a more sparing and careful way, since the highest bidders now have more to lose. Brandy then shows a clip arguing that if Apple made an iPod that was dent-proof, waterproof, and shock-resistant, which is technically possible, then they would either be too expensive to make or too expensive for the customer to buy. This is untrue. Let's say that a current iPod costs $100, and due to increased production cost, Apple would have to sell its dent-proof, waterproof, and shock-resistant iPod for $200. If the consumer decided that $100 extra dollars is worth an iPod that is dent-proof, waterproof, and shock-resistant, then that is the iPod that they will buy, and that is the iPod that Apple will sell. The Venus Project is incorrectly placing blame on the producers of products when the producers are merely serving the wishes of their customers. The Venus Project can complain about consumers having bad values all they want, something I might very well agree with, but it is invalid to argue that the producers themselves would not produce the highest quality products at a higher price, even if that is what the consumers wanted, because this is simply not true, at least in a free market. The reason this theory falls apart in a free market is because it is merely looking at the incentives of a single company, but it is ignoring the incentives of the competition. For example, the ice block salesman has a vested interest in not allowing refrigerators to come about, because that would put the ice block salesman out of a job. He likes his job of carrying ice blocks from door to door. He doesn't like the idea of manufacturing refrigerators, so he doesn't. The theory of planned obsolescence would point to this and say, aha, planned obsolescence. The ice block salesman is intentionally being inefficient. But in a free market, what is to stop a refrigerator company from competing with the ice block salesman by selling refrigerators? Is it not in the refrigerator company's self-interest to sell those refrigerators? Let's say that I make a living selling widgets, and the bulk of my sales come from people buying replacements to their old widgets. Then I find out that I could make a widget that lasts forever. However, I determined that I would prefer a continuous stream of income from reselling the widgets, so I choose to only sell the widgets that break down. But that would not necessarily be the incentive of other widget sellers. Some widget sellers might very well prefer to sell these forever-lasting widgets at a higher price, so that they can make one giant lump sum of profits in the present as opposed to small, steady amounts of profits into the future. We need to realize that different people have different time preferences. Some people are perfectly willing to sacrifice future profits for smaller present profits, and some people are perfectly willing to sacrifice present profits for larger future profits. For example, what if I proposed to either give you $1 a month for the rest of your life, or $100 right now? Which would you choose? But let's say that all of the widget sellers have come to the conclusion that they would prefer to not sell the forever-lasting widget, so that they may all have continuous future profits. What is to stop a non-widget seller from figuring out the secret to making a forever lasting widget? What's to stop someone from holding a cash prize that will be awarded to the first person to make a forever lasting widget public? The short life widget cartel not only has to make sure that none of its members breaks the secret agreements being impossible to enforce, by the way, and that the secret of forever lasting widgets doesn't get out, but the short life widget cartel is continuously taking the risk that someone who is not in the cartel will independently figure out how to make the forever lasting widgets, a variable that the widget cartel simply could not control for so long as we are in a free market and the government does not intervene to make competition illegal. So the real decision that the widget sellers have to make is not to either keep the forever lasting widget a secret and continue collecting small profits forever and ever on replacements, as opposed to making one lump sum of profits in the present by selling the forever lasting widgets. No. The real decision is either make the one lump sum of profits in the present, or let someone else inevitably beat you to the punch sooner or later and leave you royally screwed. This is why planned obsolescence, in a free market at least, would never last. And pointing out cases of planned obsolescence under state-controlled economies is completely irrelevant, because under a state-controlled economy, the short-life widget cartel need merely declare the forever-lasting widget to be their intellectual property, and then use the power of the state to make it illegal for any competition to market it. Brandy goes back to showing a clip of Peter saying that it is the state that stops monopolies from forming. Let's go over some of the theories for how a business can supposedly gain a monopoly in a free market. One of the theories is that a business could buy out all of its competition and then raise its prices once it has a monopoly. But in order for you to buy out your competition, you need to go into debt. And if you want to buy out all of your competition so that you're the only person left in the market sector, then you would need to go very into debt, because the remaining competitors will continually increase the price of their business as more and more of them are bought out. And so let's say that you do this, that you buy out all of your competition and go very heavily into debt. In order to pay off the interest on that debt, you're going to need to increase your profit margin by increasing your prices. But other businessmen who were not originally in that market sector now look over and see, hey, he's making a huge profit margin. And so they are incentivized to jump into that market sector now and compete against you. And since they only took a loan for starting up the business, they have far less debt than you do. And they are thus able to underbid you and take a huge chunk of your market share and destroy your monopoly. Although it is technically possible to gain a monopoly over a specific field, it is not possible to overcharge on your product for any length of time, because all of the other entrepreneurs have the ability to jump into that market and compete against you at any time they wish. Another theory is that businesses will collude with each other to raise prices. While this has indeed been attempted many times in the past, it never lasts without the help of government. And it never lasts for one very simple reason. The motivation behind why a particular business joined the cartel in the first place, maximizing profits, is the very motivation for why it will be incentivized to betray the cartel. Let's say that you and a few other businesses are in the gadget business, and you all hold a secret meeting where you all agree that everyone is going to raise their gadget price together. Let's say that the cartel agrees to raise the gadget price to $10. Now, bearing in mind that your motivation is to maximize your profits, what is your incentive here? Is your incentive to charge $10 like all the other cartel members? No. Your incentive is to underbid the cartel and charge lower than $10 so as to obtain all of the gadget customers and thus make higher profits through increased volume. And thus, this incentive for the individual members of a cartel to betray the cartel and underbid it is what leads to the cartel always breaking up and never being able to maintain its artificially high prices. Another theory is that a business could use predatory pricing by pricing their gadgets at a price below what it costs to make them in the first place, thus making it impossible for the competition to match your prices, and thus making the competition go out of business after a while. And then once you have a monopoly, you jack up your prices, you jack your prices back up. There are plenty of ways that the competition could protect themselves against this. A very simple method is for the competition to simply buy up your gadgets at the below cost prices and then resell the gadgets at a higher price, thus allowing the competition to continually make profits while you are continually going deeper and deeper into debt. We can spend all day trying to think of ways for a business to gain a monopoly in a market sector. But the point is that even if they are able to do it, they are not able to artificially increase the price or artificially decrease the quality, since that will incentivize even more competition to jump back into the market sector and outcompete them. The only way that a monopoly could maintain its status of charging an artificially high price or selling artificially low quality is if the government enacts licenses, certifications, price controls, patents, taxes, and other laws and regulations that give a disadvantage to competition and make competition all out illegal. For more detail on this, I would recommend watching my video, Evil Monopolies or Fairy Tales in Free Markets. Brandy then says that it might seem fair that those who supposedly produce more value deserve more compensation. But produce more value according to whom? That when we measure the value of one's productivity on the whims of consumers and the incentive is to generate profit, we end up with the creator of Beanie Babies earning more money than someone researching the cure for a rare disease. Again, I would agree that the values of consumers in this consumptionistic culture should be changed. But that does not mean that we should therefore blame the market for this. It's quite easy to look back in history and see that the more Keynesian our government became in artificially pushing consumer spending, the more consumers began spending their money on useless things that no one really needs. This consumptionistic culture is the fault of failed Keynesian policies, not the market. And of all people, I would think that the Venus Project would understand more than anyone else that materialism is not inherent to human nature, and thus we can indeed change our values to ones that focus more heavily on charity and technological progress and still exist in a market system. Although we would still have the motivation to make money in a market system, the values we possess that determine what we spend that money on are influenced by the zeitgeist of society, something that can and hopefully will be changed. Brandy then goes back to a clip of Peter asking what choice do the million starving people on this planet have with respect to this system. Again, Peter is saying that this apple is red, therefore all apples are red. Brandy says that the assumption that it is only more efficient to recycle when the resource is scarce is not taking ecology into account. This is not exactly what I said. What I said was that as technology progresses and resources become more scarce, i.e. they increase in price, then it will become more economically efficient to switch to a more sustainable method. I am not saying that we should wait until 99% of all finite resources have been consumed before switching to something sustainable. Let me give an example of what I mean. Let's say that if we were to switch from oil to thermal energy right now, then it would require the burning of 100 million barrels of oil. But let's say that we wait 30 years for technology to progress and make the switch more scientifically efficient so that only 10 million barrels of oil are consumed in the switching process. And let's say that in the meantime of those 30 years, 30 million barrels of oil are consumed. That means that if we waited 30 years, we would only consume 40 million barrels of oil to make the switch, rather than attempting to make the switch right now, which would consume 100 million barrels of oil. So the option of waiting 30 years is actually more economically, scientifically, and ecologically efficient than switching right now. But of course, we are not omniscient and are not able to have a bird's eye view of this scenario, so we have to guess when the right time is to make the switch. and the best way to make that guess of when the right time is to make the switch is to rely on the decisions of entrepreneurs who are basing them off of the price signals in the market. Brandy says that the notion that cartels will eventually collapse because one company will inevitably lower their prices is merely a gamble and is not based on anything absolute. In fact, if it were universally true that deviating from their price agreement would cause their own cartel to collapse, then that knowledge alone would discourage the business in question from lowering their prices in the interest of maintaining a successful cartel. No. The reason that a business joins a cartel is to make more money. And so if him betraying the cartel means that he will make more money, then he will do exactly that. There is no honor amongst thieves. He does not care whether the cartel gets broken apart or not. What he cares about is making more money. Let's again say that I am in the gadget business, and I join the gadget cartel, which pushes the price up to $10. Let's say that this causes 40% of the customers to no longer buy any more gadgets. We need to keep in mind that although it's certainly possible for monopolies to form over specific market sectors, those monopolies are still having to compete with other businesses in completely different market sectors. For example, Microsoft is competing directly against Southwestern Airlines. How so? Because I can decide to take a plane to Hawaii and lay out on the beach for the next few days, or I can decide to spend the next few days playing my Xbox. And so even if you do have a complete monopoly over a particular market sector, you can only raise the price so high that if you raise the price anymore, then you will actually lose less, then you will actually make less money in total due to fewer sales. So back to the gadget cartel. The price is now $10 a gadget, and let's say that the production cost of each gadget is only $1. And let's say that our gadget cartel is selling 1 million gadgets per month, and that there are 10 of us in the cartel, which means that I am making a net profit of $900,000 a month. But what if I decided to betray the cartel and charge $5 for my gadgets? Well, then not only would 100% of all of the existing customers buy from me instead of the cartel, there would be an extra 40% in sales on top of that from all of the people who come back to buy the gadget at its new lower price. So I would sell 1.4 million gadgets at a price of $5 each, meaning that I make a net profit of $5.6 million. $5.6 million is a lot more than 900,000. And so if my goal is to make more money, then I will betray the cartel. But even if you are not convinced by this logic, then let me add that the voluntary society I advocate would have mechanisms to safeguard against the possibility of monopolies if you still believe that to be a threat. The voluntary society could decide that the ownership of certain scarce resources is conditional upon you not going beyond a certain percentage of total ownership. And if you do, then you have forfeited your property and you are blacklisted from society. If you would like more detail on this, I'd recommend watching my State is Not Great video at just past 41 minutes in. Brandy then says that my theory that this consumptionistic culture we currently have is due to Keynesian policies being enacted is a stretch, because there is a difference between creating the illusion that people can spend money that they don't have and creating the actual artificial material desires to spend it on. While I would agree that it takes two to tango, I would also point out that our culture could also be so materialistic because of our lack of critical thinking ability. And who is in charge of educating our society's children? The state. Yes, the goal of a business is profit, but what is profitable is dependent upon the values of consumers. If the consumers value conservation, then that is what will be profitable. Brandy goes back to a clip of Peter saying that machines have pushed humans into the service sector, and that machines could easily take over the service sector right now if we wished. This is not true. Robots are nowhere near the level necessary to mimic the social human interaction required for many different types of service jobs. Compared to the human mind, robots currently have the intellectual equivalent of a retarded cockroach. But even if they were able to completely take over all service sector jobs, that would not matter, because then the opportunity would open up for us humans to jump into other types of jobs that we're good at and machines are not. History is replete with technophobes pointing at machines taking over a particular job sector and then being absolutely convinced that there is no longer any other job sector for us humans to migrate into. Over and over again, the technophobes have argued that this time it's different, and over again, they were wrong. Peter is making the very same mistake. Alright, on to Brandy's second video. She tries to make the point that objective values actually do exist in the context of biological necessity. Food, water, shelter, etc. I've already gone over this earlier in the video, so let me just add that the term value is subjective to its very core. Although it is true that there are objective biological requirements for humans to live, that does not mean that those biological necessities are therefore objective values, since the choice of whether you wish to live or not is still subjective. I could use the same logic to argue that it is objectively true that if I let go of a tennis ball, it will drop to the ground, and that therefore it is an objective value to drop tennis balls on the ground, which it is not. It's important to note that I did not say that the resource-based economy would end up in mass starvation, but rather that mass starvation would be a pretty good indicator that you are misallocating resources. What I said about the resource-based economy is that it would indeed misallocate resources since it has no private property, exchange, or money, and thus no way to make economic calculations. But I will at least agree that the last thing to go in the resource-based economy will be rotating bunk beds and potatoes. I think they'll at least have a few of those covered pretty well. Brandy says that I seem to think that prices are the only way to determine scientific efficiency. No, we can determine scientific efficiency without prices. What we cannot determine without prices is economic efficiency. Without prices, we cannot calculate heterogeneous resources with each other, which means that we are not able to determine production costs, which means that we are not able to determine the marginal utility of consumers. Brandy says that profit does not always mean that you're using resources the most efficiently. Now, I would certainly agree that profit is that profit that is the result of state intervention guarantees that you did not use resources in the most efficiently. And I would also say that profit does not necessarily mean that you were using resources in the most scientifically efficient way. But making a profit in a free market is indeed an indicator that you are using resources in the most economically efficient way. Brandy then uses an example of cars versus a train, that you would make a bunch of profit by selling cars, but would not be able to make a profit with a train, even if the train is what's most economically efficient. I would have to disagree with this. You could indeed make a profit from a train. You just need to charge for tickets. I would also say that I believe that without the government intervention of creating all of these roads, public transportation would indeed be much more widespread than it is today. Brandy then alludes to transportation being a natural monopoly, as having multiple monorails would be redundant and inefficient. It might very well be true that things like roads and trains are natural monopolies, and so in the voluntary society that I advocate, perhaps such transportation systems would be built, maintained, and profit-shared with all of the community members that the transportation system inhabits, thus preventing any incentive for charging artificially high prices. Brandy says that one of the things she doesn't feel I address is the incentive to lie, cheat, and steal in a market system. She gives the example of a pharmaceutical company that is selling a decent product, but at some point they figure out that it might have harmful effects in people 20 years down the line. Is the pharmaceutical company immediately incentivized to tell people to stop buying their product? The answer is absolutely. Businesses have recalls on their products all the time, even without the government telling them to. If a business finds out that one of their products is harmful and they intentionally keep their mouths shut, then they will inevitably lose all of their profits in a class action lawsuit sooner or later. And the competing pharmaceutical companies have every incentive to test their competition's products and make public any harmful effects that are being kept secret so as to increase their own business. Now, of course, there will always be fly-by-night fraudsters who are more than happy to steal your money, which is why it's a good idea to only do business with reputable companies who don't have the ability to disappear tomorrow. But not only will competition be looking over each other's shoulders, there could very well also be rating agencies that you could subscribe to that would test the products of various companies and only recommend the ones they find the most satisfactory. Brandy then asks how I would do away with advertising. First, I'd encourage you to watch my video, The State is Not Great, to better understand the kind of system that I am advocating. As far as doing away with advertising, I imagine the simplest way will be for society to decide to reduce the reputation rating or blacklist any company that engages in paid advertising. But this really isn't necessary, because as society gains higher critical thinking abilities, due in part to no more state schooling, advertising will naturally no longer be profitable, since impulsive buying will dwindle into non-existence. She goes on to ask what is to stop a company from paying a rating agency to give them favorable reviews. The simple fact that society would not want them to, and so they would enact preventative measures to ensure against that very possibility. Things like complete transparency in the rating agency, and ensuring that there are multiple rating agencies competing against each other, so each one has the incentive to look for and make public any corruption in the other. And, of course, very stiff punishments for any rating agency caught taking bribes. But these are just ideas that are coming off the top of my head. I'm sure that this voluntary society, once enacted in reality, will figure out solutions that I have yet to even conceive. Brandy makes the point that you can have innovation without competition. And I would agree with this, but again, I need to make the point that you need this competitive system so that you can determine whether the innovation is something that will meet the marginal utility of consumers, or whether it is just something that increases your own personal utility. And we are on to Brandy's third video. Brandy starts off quoting me saying that we can only determine marginal utility if we take production cost into account. Otherwise, we would just be making a wish list that is based off of the assumption that resources are infinite. She responds saying that this is the exact opposite of what the resource-based economy does. To which I would respond, how so? If you acknowledge that you cannot determine marginal utility without production cost, then how are you communicating production cost to the consumer when the prices of all of the products are zero? Moreover, how are you figuring out production cost in the first place, since it is impossible to calculate heterogeneous resources with each other without prices? I understand that you would be able to calculate total resource expenditure, but this is far different than production cost, as production cost is able to have consumers put together their list of marginal utility simply by looking at the prices, as opposed to communicating a resource expenditure to consumers, which forces them to have to literally have a complete understanding of all possible production processes that take place before they can even begin to put together a list of marginal utility, something that is impossible for any one individual to master. I am not saying that the Venus Project itself assumes that resources are infinite, or even that consumers themselves assume that resources are infinite. What I am saying is that if you do not communicate production cost to the consumer, then the consumer will give you a list of what to produce that does not take production cost into account. That is, a list that assumes infinite resources. But granted, if you communicate resource expenditure to the consumer, they will not give you a list that assumes infinite resources. But that list will still not be one of marginal utility. Brandy later says that production costs will already be taken into account before the item is on the shelves. First of all, you cannot determine production costs without the input of consumers, since production cost is reliant upon placing objective values upon homogeneous resources so that they may calculate heterogeneous resources with each other. And by the way, when I say objective values, I'm talking about an intersubjective consensus. And those objective values themselves are based off of the intersubjective valuations of producers who are basing those valuations upon their best predictions of future consumer marginal utility. And once these products are actually on the shelves with a price, they will finally be able to determine what the actual consumer marginal utility turned out to be, so that they may continue to become better and better at making future predictions. And if you are orienting new demand based on monitoring usage of products, then the consumer has to know what the production cost is. Otherwise, the data derived from monitoring product usage would not be showing marginal utility, but would merely be showing the utility derived if the prices were all zero. She seems to continuously look at the market as if it's this social Darwinism of survival of the fittest. I see the market in a completely different way. I see the market as a way for humans to come together. The core of a market is human cooperation. It is trade. I do what I do best, you do what you do best, and then we trade with each other so that we can both be better off. And competition merely exists so as to ensure against abuse, and so that we are as efficient as possible and contributing to our maximum potential. The real beauty of the market is that it combines all of the knowledge and intellect into one single entity through the price system. It allows each one of us to make decisions as to how to best satisfy others and ourselves with the limited resources that exist, decisions that would otherwise require omniscience. Brandy argues that the wishes of humans are not infinite. While I would agree with the law of diminishing marginal utility, which is to say that your satisfaction from something diminishes the more of it you consume, and while I'm very careful in assigning any characteristics to human nature, I do think that it's pretty safe to say that it is ingrained in the nature of many humans to continue exploring and experimenting. I don't think that one day we will just stop all of our technological advancement and say, okay, we're done, we have reached optimization. No, something tells me that as long as there are stars in the sky, we will have the desire to go there, that we are going to want to explore strange new worlds, seek out new life, new civilizations, and boldly go where no one has gone before. She then says that our values need to change, something that I again completely agree with. But I simply do not see our values changing to the point of being fully satisfied with 100% scientific efficiency, that being a potato diet and sleeping on rotating bunk beds, for example. But I may be wrong. Maybe you could change human values to the point of being completely satisfied with such a minimalist existence. The Amish do indeed exist, after all. But something tells me that no matter what, you will have people who will simply not be content with that way of living, which is why the kind of society that I advocate first and foremost is a decentralized one, where different cities are allowed to take up whatever form of social organization they wish. I would be more than happy for you guys to get your own city where you can set up your resource-based economy, as long as you guys allow us voluntarists to have our own city where we can set up a voluntary market economy. And the minimalist collectivists can move to your city, and the ambitious individualists can move to ours.